So, Donald Trump signed an executive order directing the federal government to begin referring to Lake Ontario as Lake America. Now, that's ridiculous. I understand that. But there's definitely something very important underneath this because it's always about power. And maybe even more importantly, it's about the difference between the power a president actually has and the power a president can convince people that he has. So, an executive order is not the same thing as a law. Think of an executive order more like instructions from the president to the people working inside of the executive branch. Presidents have used them since the earliest days of the country. They tell federal agencies and officials how the president wants existing laws and government responsibilities to be carried out. So, yes, a president can tell the Department of the Interior that the federal maps or federal documents should all use a particular name. Now, what a president cannot do is simply decree that every American or every country in the world must suddenly adopt that name. And that distinction really matters because authoritarian power often grows not simply because someone legally possesses enormous amounts of authority, but because everyone around that person begins behaving as though they do. People comply before they actually are required to. Institutions surrender authority they still possess. People start saying, well, I guess that's just what it's called now. And suddenly, something that began as an assertion of power really starts becoming power through compliance. That's why something that sounds silly, like renaming a lake, can really still tell us something important about the political moment that we're living through. And the story is also about Canada. So, Trump has spent much of his second term escalating economic pressure on Canada. He has threatened tariffs. He's challenged the economic relationship between the two countries. He's repeatedly talked about Canada in ways that suggest the US should have substantially more control over its neighbor. The relationship matters enormously because the American and Canadian economies, they're deeply integrated. Our manufacturing systems don't neatly stop at the border. Cars, parts that cross the US Canada border multiple times during the manufacturing process before it's finished is one of the biggest examples. That integration goes back decades through NAFTA and later through USMCA. That trade agreement, Trump himself negotiated during his first administration. So, when tariffs suddenly get placed on Canadian vehicles or even parts, they're not simply punishing Canada. That raises costs for us. That raises costs for our manufacturers and ultimately the customers, which are us. And Canada has increasingly responded by saying, if the United States puts tariffs on us, we're going to respond. Prime Minister Mark Carney has also begun making something else really clear. And I don't think Canada can assume that its relationship with the US will continue operating the way that it has for generations. And Canada has to begin looking much more aggressively towards Europe and towards other trading partners. And that has consequences far beyond tariffs. So, for decades, the US has built an enormous amount of its global influence through alliances. Countries worked with us not simply because America was powerful, but because America was considered, relatively dependable. Once alliances start to realize they need alternatives to us, the US, then rebuilding that trust can take years. And in that context, renaming Lake Ontario isn't just a strange little side story. It's another way of really projecting dominance towards Canada.